What if the usual story of World War II skips the part that actually drives the whole narrative? People normally point to Hitler entering Poland in September 1939 as the spark, but treating that moment as the true beginning is like blaming the Titanic's end on a single chunk of ice. It explains the scene, not the setup. The idea behind this version of the story is different. A leftover financial mess from World War I pushed the world toward another disaster, and the banks that expected repayment shaped what came next. According to this view, Hitler's rise wasn't just politics or charisma. It suggests he became useful to the same American financial players who had already earned money during World War I. By the time Poland was invaded, the event looked less like the start of a conflict and more like the final step in a 20-year effort to recover massive unpaid debt. In this telling, those unresolved obligations from the previous war helped turn a failed painter into a tool for outside creditors. And the war that followed, the deadliest in history, ends up looking like a huge consolidation of debt, masked as ideology, revenge, and territorial expansion. This version of events doesn't start in 1939 at all. It begins 2 decades earlier, in 1919, inside the Palace of Versailles. The treaty signed there didn't just redraw borders or shrink armies. It created a financial dilemma that made another conflict feel almost unavoidable. On June 28, 1919, German officials signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors. Textbooks usually highlight the land losses or military limits, but the main blow came from Article 231. That clause placed the blame for the war entirely on Germany and cleared the way for reparations big enough to crush the economy. The final bill reached 132 billion gold marks, somewhere around $400 billion in today's terms. It wasn't only about punishment. It built a long-term structure for pulling money out of Germany year after year. And here's the part many people miss. Germany wasn't supposed to fund all of this from its own pocket. The whole setup worked as a circular system run with help from American banks. Germany would take
loans from U.S. financial institutions, then used that borrowed money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France, in turn, would forward those payments to the United States to cover their own war debts. Money left the U.S., passed through Europe, and came straight back to American creditors with extra interest layered in. The Dawes Plan of 1924 made the structure official. Named for American banker Charles Dawes, it reorganized the reparations schedule and opened the door for huge U.S. loans meant to steady Germany's shaky economy. J.P. Morgan & Co. headed a group that supplied 800 million gold marks in the first wave, and the plan didn't stop at lending money. The loans came with oversight. American advisors gained influence over German government spending and tax policies. Even the Reichsbank, the German central bank, ended up partly under foreign supervision. German railways, industrial sites, and customs income were handed over as security for those loans, and that detail carried a heavy meaning. A country that had just come out of a world war ended up living under something close to financial supervision run by the same banks that had backed its former enemies. People in Germany kept working, paying taxes, running their businesses, but a chunk of the money they generated went straight to American creditors before the German state could even consider using it for its own needs. And this setup wasn't unusual. A similar structure had been forced on the Ottoman Empire in 1875. The difference was scale. Now, the same model was being pushed onto one of Europe's biggest industrial nations. The Young Plan of 1929 changed the numbers a bit and stretched the timeline again. It lowered the total reparations figure, but pushed the payment schedule all the way to 1988. That meant 59 years of obligations. Kids born in 1929 would spend their whole working lives paying for a war they never saw, tied to a bill written before they took their first breath.
A story about finance, how people live, in interesting but calm voice. The Young Plan added another layer, too. It led to the creation of the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland in 1930. The idea was that the BIS would coordinate and manage these international financial transfers. In practice, it became a sort of central bank for central banks, the place where German payments would be funneled, sorted, and passed on to the nations expecting money. From 1924 to 1930, American investors lent Germany 27 billion marks. During that same period, Germany paid out 19 billion marks in reparations. So the country was borrowing more than it was sending back, but that was never the core issue. The real purpose was to lock in a structure that kept Germany tied to long-term financial oversight. As long as loans arrived on schedule and reparations continued, the whole machine ran smoothly on paper. But everyone knew what the weak point was. If the loans stopped, the whole thing would break. And that's exactly what happened in 1929. After the American stock market collapse in October, the flow of U.S. credit into Germany froze almost immediately. The entire reparations process depended on those American loans. Without them, Germany had no way to keep up payments. Once Germany couldn't pay, Britain and France couldn't meet their own obligations to the United States. The whole circular flow jammed, and every country involved found itself exposed. For Germany, the fallout was brutal. Joblessness shot from 1.3 million in 1929 to more than 6 million by 1932. Factories shut down, output dropped, banks hovered close to total collapse. The Weimar government, already blamed for accepting the reparations terms, became tied to the economic collapse in the eyes of ordinary citizens. And none of this was random. The debt structure built at Versailles left Germany almost defenseless against a shock coming from outside its borders. Once American credit disappeared, Germany had nothing to soften the blow, no reserve, no buffer. And here's the part that matters most.
While many ordinary Germans were breaking under the Depression, banks in the United States and Britain that held huge amounts of German debt were sliding into their own trouble. They had poured billions into German companies, German banks, and the German government. A full German collapse meant those loans would go bad, hitting institutions already weakened after the 1929 crash. So these banks needed Germany in a strange middle zone, stable enough to keep sending payments, but not strong enough to push back against debt terms or walk away from them. That's the setting in which Adolf Hitler shows up. Back in 1930, the Nazi Party sat on the sidelines of politics. It was a fringe group with no real national influence. Yet by 1933, Hitler was sitting in the Chancellor's office of Germany. People usually explain this rise by pointing to his intense speeches, the anger left over from Versailles, and the desperation caused by the economic collapse. Those things mattered, but they don't explain the financial engine that powered the Nazi climb, or the banking interests that gained from it. Around 1930, major German industrial firms started directing large sums of money to the Nazi Party. These weren't rare or symbolic donations. They were steady, organized flows coming from companies like IG Farben, the chemical powerhouse, Krupp, known for steel and weapons, and Thyssen, tied to coal and steel. The obvious question is simple. How were these firms finding money to bankroll political groups while factories were closing and people were out of work? The money came from American loans and investments that kept moving into certain German industries even after general lending had nearly stopped. The Bank for International Settlements, set up in 1930 to handle reparations, became one of the main paths for this money. It operated above national laws, and its activities weren't open to public oversight. Meetings were private, and its board included figures from the German Reichsbank, the Bank of France,
England, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and other big European central banks. The BIS could shift funds in ways that most people, even government officials, never saw. When Hitler took office in January 1933, you might think American banks would pull back. Instead, the opposite happened. American investment in Germany jumped sharply from 1933 to 1939. Why would U.S. financial institutions lend to a regime like that? The reasoning was blunt. Hitler said he would bring order, keep labor unions under control, and, most importantly, keep paying Germany's international debts. For American creditors, he looked safer than a Germany drifting toward communism or collapsing to the point where it couldn't pay anything at all. Once you dig into the actual records, the level of American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany is far larger than most people expect. IBM, working through its German arm Die Homog, supplied punch card systems that let the Nazi state track people, run censuses, and organize the machinery that later drove the Holocaust. Thomas Watson, who led IBM at the time, accepted the Merit Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler in 1937 and kept business ties with the Nazi government all through the 1930s. General Motors, operating in Germany through Opel, also folded itself into the regime's push for rearmament. By 1938, Opel was rolling out trucks for the Wehrmacht, and Ford's German branch was gearing its factories for the same kind of military output. Standard Oil, tied to the Rockefeller family, kept broad partnerships with IG Farben, the chemical giant that produced Zyklon Bass for concentration camps. The two companies shared patents on synthetic rubber and fuel, which became key because Germany lacked enough natural rubber and petroleum to support a long war. These agreements weren't small side deals. They sat at the center of how Germany rebuilt its military power. After World War I and the economic collapse that followed, the country's factories and resources were weakened. The fast expansion of its armed forces from 1933 to 1939
depended on outside capital, technical know-how, and industrial machines that came in large part from major American firms. The most striking links came from banking. Prescott Bush, father of George H.W. Bush and grandfather of George W. Bush, was a partner and director at Brown Brothers Harriman. The bank held deep ties with German industrial groups, including those connected to Fritz Thyssen, one of Hitler's earliest and most influential financial supporters. Union Banking Corporation, where Bush also served as a director, had its assets seized by the U.S. government in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act because of its involvement with Nazi financial networks. This wasn't a case of minor overlap or accidental contact. These were core financial pipelines that helped fuel the Nazi war economy. Chase Bank, the commercial arm of J.P. Morgan, kept its Paris office open even after Germany occupied France. Chase Paris froze Jewish accounts and sold off their assets, working directly in line with Nazi rules on seizing Jewish property. This wasn't done under threat. It was a choice to keep good standing with German authorities and remain active in European markets. The decisions were well documented, yet executives faced almost no real consequences once the war ended. The Bank for International Settlements stayed active through the entire conflict, acting as a neutral clearing point for both Allied and Axis central banks. The BIS helped move Nazi gold, including gold taken from Holocaust victims, and turned it into a currency that could be used across borders. This financial channel continued running even in the middle of the war, giving Germany access to international transactions despite global fighting. American and British members of the bank's board kept showing up to meetings in neutral Switzerland all through the war. They sat in the same room with the German and Italian delegates, kept the discussions going, and acted as if nothing unusual was happening. When this all came out later, no one
Faced charges. The international system depended too much on the BIS, and no one wanted a legal fight that might disrupt how money moved across borders. By 1939, Germany carried big debts to American banks in large U.S. companies. At the same time, it held major claims against countries in Eastern Europe that had borrowed heavily from German lenders in the 1920s. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and others had taken on German loans during the DOS and Young Plan years, and those obligations were still on the books. When Germany pushed into Poland in September 1939,
The attack wasn't only about borders or ideology. It also had a financial angle that most people never hear about. By taking over Eastern Europe, Germany gained direct control over these nations' resources and the power to squeeze payment on those older debts. The usual story about Hitler focuses on racial ideas and his push for more space for Germans. That mattered, but it leaves out the economic logic that shaped the choices of Germany's creditors. If Germany grabbed territory with valuable raw materials, it could create the income it needed to keep paying American banks. If the German economy collapsed instead, those same loans would go unpaid. For creditors, German expansion wasn't a disaster. It was the most effective way to get their money back. This helps explain behavior that looks irrational at first glance. American banks kept giving credit to Nazi Germany even as Hitler's plans became obvious. American corporations kept selling supplies that fed the German military buildup during the 1930s. They weren't confused about what was coming. They simply understood that a Germany strong enough to dominate Eastern Europe would be a Germany able to gather the resources needed to meet its obligations. A weak Germany would default. A powerful Germany could seize what it needed from its neighbors and keep the payments flowing.
Countries to cover the cost of their own occupation. France alone was pushed into paying more than 860 million marks every year, a sum that exceeded the expenses of the German forces stationed there. The extra money didn't improve life in France or anywhere else under occupation. It went to Berlin, where it helped Germany keep up with its international debts and continue funding the war machine. The financial picture shifted again once the United States entered the war in 1941. As in World War I, American involvement changed the entire debt structure. Washington began offering huge loans to Britain and the other allies through the Lend-Lease program, reshaping who owed what and who had the power to decide the economic terms of the conflict. By the time the war finally ended, the total value of Lend-Lease support had passed $50 billion, a figure that would land somewhere near $700 billion in today's money. Britain went into the conflict as a creditor, with an empire stretched across continents, yet came out of it buried under debts to the United States that would linger for generations. The same script from World War I played out again. A major European war forced governments to borrow fast, and that urgency opened the door for American banks to take the lead as global lenders to countries that had once competed with the U.S. economically. Every shell factories turned out, every tank rolling off production lines, every bomber heading toward the front, all of it carried financial obligations attached to American credit. Those debts would remain long after troops went home and the front lines went quiet. The longer the fighting dragged on, the deeper Europe sank into American loans, and the more Europe borrowed, the more solid America's financial leverage became. In July 1944, while battles still raged, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The stated goal was noble enough: create a global monetary framework to reduce the risk of future wars. But the real goal was more straightforward. The
United States wanted a formal system that locked in the financial dominance it had gained through the conflict. The Bretton Woods Agreement did exactly that. It placed the U.S. dollar at the center of the world economy, fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. Every other currency would tie itself to the dollar. International trade would run through the dollar system, and the new institutions created to oversee global finance, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, would sit in Washington, fully shaped by American influence. In simple terms, this meant the United States walked out of World War II holding most of the planet's gold reserves, controlling the reserve currency everyone else needed, and becoming the key source of credit for rebuilding shattered countries. Europe and Japan had no real choice. Their cities, industries, and infrastructure were wrecked. To rebuild, they needed loans, and those loans came from American institutions,
priced in American dollars. That setup guaranteed constant global demand for the U.S. currency. Because the dollar served as the reserve currency, the United States could cover its import costs by issuing more dollars, while other countries had to earn those dollars by exporting goods. Through the war, America gained the kind of monetary power Britain had once enjoyed before World War I, the power to pull wealth from global trade simply by controlling the currency system that trade depended on. Then came the Marshall Plan in 1947. It offered $13 billion to help Western Europe get back on its feet. History usually presents it as an act of generosity, but the structure tells a different story. The money functioned largely as loans, even if the terms were easier than usual. Countries that took the aid agreed to open their economies to American products, give American investors advantages, and shape their foreign policies in ways that lined up with Washington's goals. The money helped rebuild Europe, but it also tied Europe into a framework where American economic leadership was guaranteed for decades.
And this is where the financial character of the post-war world becomes impossible to ignore. Germany came out of the war defeated and broken, but the way it was treated after 1945 looked nothing like the punishment it faced after Versailles. The country was split into occupation zones, and there were reparations, but they were mild compared to the crushing terms imposed after World War I. This wasn't out of sympathy. American officials understood that forcing Germany into another mountain of impossible debt would only spark chaos, ruin trade, and put American money at risk. So West Germany got Marshall Plan funds, had its debts reorganized in a way it could actually handle, and was pushed back onto its feet as a major industrial state tied into the U.S.-led economic network. East Germany had a different fate under Soviet control. Instead of aid, it was stripped of resources, factories, and equipment. The damage from that approach lasted for generations. While the West rebuilt, the East stayed stuck in economic decline. Meanwhile, the Bank for International Settlements kept going as if the war had barely touched it. This same institution had handled Nazi gold transfers during the conflict, yet after 1945, nobody was punished and nothing meaningful changed. The BIS was simply too convenient for central banks. It worked outside the reach of national laws and stayed free from democratic oversight. It's still in Basel today, still running quiet meetings and financial operations that the public never gets to see. Sorting out the financial leftovers of World War II took ages. Britain didn't finish paying off its Lend-Lease debts to the United States until 2006. Germany made the very last payment tied to World War I in 2010, almost a century after the guns went silent. But the debts linked to World War II were treated differently. They were forgiven or rebuilt into manageable plans, not because of kindness, but because lenders realized that a country able to pay slowly and steadily is far more profitable than one crushed into default. A debtor that stays alive is worth more than one that collapses.
A story about finance, how people live, an interesting but calm voice. The Cold War, usually framed as a fight between democracy and totalitarianism, or capitalism and communism, also had a financial layer beneath the slogans. The Soviet Union ran an economic model that didn't rely on the dollar, U.S. banks, or the institutions created at Bretton Woods. The entire Soviet bloc skipped the IMF, the World Bank, and the debt-driven structure the United States controlled. But the arms race recreated the same pattern seen in the earlier world wars. Keeping up with military production required huge borrowing. The United States spent trillions on nuclear weapons, global bases, and countless proxy wars. The Soviet Union, trying to keep pace, took out massive loans from Western banks to buy grain and technology. Those debts didn't vanish. They piled up and put pressure on an already strained system. When the USSR finally collapsed in 1991, it didn't fall to an invading army. It ran out of money.
The Soviet government couldn't carry the financial weight of trying to match U.S. military spending year after year. The bankruptcy came first, the political breakdown followed. The same pattern that started in 1919 and was refined by 1945 never really went away. It still shapes global politics and the financial world that exists today. International conflicts keep creating moments where governments have no choice but to borrow fast, and that opens the door for big financial institutions to shape national policy for decades. You can see it in the 2008 financial crisis. Major banks pushed risky lending for years, crashed the system, and then got rescued with trillions in public money. Taxpayers carried the debt, while those same banks walked away stronger than before, with even more influence and higher profits. The story isn't new. The institutions that made huge gains during World War II still sit at the top today. J.P. Morgan Chase, which came directly out of J.P. Morgan and the company that financed both world wars, is now the biggest bank in America. Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo also trace their power back to the same wartime financial networks, and together they control trillions. The global system still
runs on the dollar, a setup locked in at Bretton Woods. The IMF and World Bank still enforce austerity on debtor nations, pushing policies that protect creditors, even when those policies hurt ordinary people. Look at what's happening now with U.S.-China tensions. It's not mainly about political values or human rights. It's about control over the world's financial structure. China holds more than $1 trillion in U.S. government debt. The United States uses its dollar dominance to punish rivals through sanctions that often hit harder than direct military action. Whatever the next big conflict looks like, economic or military, it will rearrange global debt ties just like World War I and World War II did. Now, put the pieces together. World War I ended with Germany stuck under impossible debt. That pressure wrecked the economy and let American banks step in to reorganize German payments in ways that gave those banks real control over German financial decisions. When everything fell apart in 1929, Hitler came to power with help from German industrialists who relied on American loans. From 1933 to 1939, American corporations kept doing business in Germany and helped rebuild its military strength because those deals paid well. The Bank for International Settlements kept moving money between Allied and Axis countries even during the war. World War II became another round of forced debt settlement. Germany's takeover of Eastern Europe let it pull out resources to meet international obligations, while the Allies borrowed heavily from American banks, locking in long-term U.S. financial dominance. Bretton Woods later turned that dominance into formal global structure. The Marshall Plan put Europe in debt to the United States and opened European markets to American companies. The same pattern kept going through the Cold War, through the financial crises, and into today's global standoffs. Prescott Bush, whose bank financed Nazi industrialists, ended up in the U.S. Senate. His son became president. His grandson became president. The corporate and banking figures who earned
A story about finance, how people live, an interesting but calm voice. Fortunes dealing with Nazi Germany never faced charges or consequences. Their influence carried forward, and the system they helped build still shapes global power now. People still argue that the same financial structures that once helped Hitler rise never lost their place. In this view, nothing about that era was an accident or a slip in judgment. The claim is that the setup ran the way it was built to run. War piles up debt. Debt gives whoever holds it a strong grip, and that grip brings steady profit. Once you see the pattern laid out like that, a lot of present-day events start to feel less random and more like repetition. People raise the same questions over and over. Why do the biggest financial institutions seem to benefit whenever a new conflict breaks out?
Why do sudden crises usually leave governments with heavier debt loads instead of calmer borders or reduced tensions? And why do peace deals almost always include long financial clauses that overshadow the political parts everyone talks about on camera? The argument behind these questions is simple. Wars aren't mainly about ideology or land or political grudges. They're described here as tools that reinforce a debt-driven setup that keeps paying out to creditors no matter which army ends up holding a city. Under this lens, the images we all know, Nazi flags and old newsreels, troops rolling into Poland, bombs dropping on London, stop looking like pure military movements and start looking like steps in a huge, violent form of debt enforcement. Every shell fired, every street leveled, every life lost becomes, in this interpretation, another line on a balance sheet that benefits the lenders who shaped the financial conditions long before the shooting started. Peace wasn't as profitable as destruction, so destruction kept winning. World War II, in this telling, didn't erupt only because Hitler was evil, though he was. It erupted because the unpaid debt left hanging after World War I created a problem that couldn't be solved inside normal economic math. A second massive conflict was treated as the reset button that would clear the old obligations and set up new financial rankings.
By this logic, the world we live in today wasn't carved out by generals or diplomats. It was shaped by the funding that ran those wars, and by the people who controlled that funding. That structure, not battlefield glory or political speeches, explains why our current global system so often puts debt payments above basic human needs, protects creditor authority over national independence, and favors bank stability over democratic decision-making. In this narrative, the bankers didn't just watch World War II happen, they pushed the forces that made it unavoidable. They settled their accounts through the deaths of tens of millions, and the world kept carrying the weight of that outcome long after the last shot was fired.